It's worth doing a deep dive like that on a band as good as XTC. I think they warrant it.
I think so too. I could have gone on for another hour about it.
Hi everyone, it's James here. Welcome to another video, and today I am delighted to be joined by a very special guest. I have with me Jeff Party. Hi Jeff.
Hello, how are you?
Very well, thanks. How are you?
Doing well here. Doing well.
Good stuff. In your new abode.
Fairly new, yeah. I've been here since March, I guess now. But so that means, what is it, August? A few months, but yeah, it still feels like it's a new thing. I like the new room.
Cool, excellent. All right, well, today we're going to be talking about a band that we're both very fond of, that band being XTC. And
yes.
This is a band that features quite a lot on the vinyl community, on YouTube or whatever. In fact, when I first discovered the VC, there were a couple of bands I was surprised at how popular they actually were. One was Genesis, who everybody seemed to like.
Yeah.
And the other was XTC. I was quite amazed, particularly in North America. There seems to be a lot of North American XTC fans, yourself being one of the main ones I can think of, really. How did you first discover XTC? What's your kind of origin story?
When I was approximately 10, 11 years old, MTV came into existence, and we got it quite early on in my house. I guess it was noticeable at the time was that many of the videos they would show in those early days were by British acts. I think British acts were quite far ahead of the game as far as making video. I guess then they called them promo clips or whatever. So many of the acts they would show would be English and British. So one of the clips I saw quite early on, it had to be 83-ish, was Senses Working Overtime. And, being already a huge Beatles fan, first of all, I was interested by default in anything British. And second of all, that song really, with how melodic it was and how catchy the chorus was, and just the style, and Dave Gregory had a Rickenbacker he was playing. It reminded me a bit of, it seemed a bit Beatley, and it appealed to me. So that was the first time I ever saw or heard XTC, was just seeing that video. Fast forward to a few years later, I didn't buy the record or anything, but I always remembered that song. But a few years later, I was reading, my dad used to get a couple different music magazines, and he was subscribed to a few. And one of them was called Stereo Review, and they had a record review section every month, and they would have in that section the best recording of the month. And then one day I was just looking at that, and it had to be spring of '87. They featured Skylarking by XTC as the best recording of the month, the best new recording of the month. And so the review was only 3 paragraphs long, but it really intrigued me. It compared it to Sgt. Pepper, and he called out Earn Enough for Us in particular. I think description was, it sounds like a Bruce Springsteen song, as Paul McCartney might have produced it in 1967. So I was hooked right there. So I remembered XTC completely. I was like, oh, that's that group that did that song, Senses Working Overtime, that I liked. So I showed that review to my father, and he was intrigued. He's a huge Beatles and Sgt. Pepper fan in particular as well. So we went out and bought that album just based on the review. He actually bought it, actually. We went to the mall, and amazingly, they had a copy there, and brought it home, listened to it. And I loved it from the first go. So I was an XTC fan at that point. That album just beguiled me. I loved it. I still love it to this day. I never get tired of it. So that would have been the spring of '87 or early summer. So my dad wasn't too keen on it. He had Sgt. Pepper in his brain, and this was the only. I remember him saying the only part that sounds Beatley to me is that descending string line that connects Ballet for a Rainy Day to 1,000 Umbrellas. That reminded him of Glass Onion. Yeah, the string. That, but otherwise he wasn't quite as Beatley as he was hoping or expecting. But I loved it. It was great.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know what happened, because I missed XTC first time around, and it's such a strange thing, because I was such a big pop chart fan, when I was kind of, going back to 1978, 79, when I first got into the pop charts. And XTC, I just missed them completely. I don't know how that happened. I used to watch Top of the Pops every week, just never saw them, just one of those strange things. But I don't know how I first came about Skylarking, but I would imagine I probably read something about it in one of those music magazines, Q magazine or one of those magazines that was around. And I was always looking for these great albums that you were supposed to have heard. So I suspect that's what I did. But I've got a very clear memory of it. It would have been about 97, 98, as late as that I first heard this. And it was one of the most perfect introductions to a band or an album I think I've ever had, in the sense that it was a very, very hot day. I remember I'd gone out to buy the record in the morning. I bought it from HMV or Virgin, in the morning. And I was going out with my friends in the afternoon, and we just happened to be going out to the river. There's a river in a place called Otley, which is in West Yorkshire. And it was a brilliant hot summer's day, and we were all going to be, jumping in the water and having a great time, frolicking around in the summer. And before we went, I happened to think, right, I'll just, give this CD a quick spin, listen to it, and it was almost like, I can't quite believe I've just heard that album, and I've got to go out now, and I can't play it again until I come back. It was kind of like, wow, right.
Yeah.
Because there are some records which creep up on you, and there are some which take a bit of time. But this one, it was like straight out of the gate, every track. I was like, love this, love this,
Yeah.
love this, love this, every song. And then I had to go out. I had this glorious day, summer's day with the river and the bird song and everything. Came back, listened to it again. And of course, it starts with Summer's Cauldron with the sound of summer, such a summery vibe to it. And it was still, the sun was still shining when I came home and listened to it. And it was like, what more perfect? It's just a strange coincidence. One of those, just the ultimate summer's day album discovered on a summer's day.
That's perfect. Yes, definitely true. It has that feel. The thing about those sound effects that open Summer's Cauldron and they just kind of buzz through in the background and they come back at the end of Grass. And, the fact that the second song was called Grass, it did very much, there's a very tangible feeling of summer, at least to the beginning of the record.
And then, of course, you start to read about XTC and you get into the history of it all. This idea that they were paired up with Todd Rundgren, this kind of, genius maverick producer, because they wanted to have their sound, or the record company, Virgin, wanted them to try and appeal more to the American market. And Todd just basically just sequenced the record himself without any consultation with Andy Partridge, phoned him up and said, right, the songs are going to be in this order, and you need to come out to America, and we're going to record them in this order. We're going to record them as almost like a kind of live album. It's such a strange way to approach it.
It's a very unusual way to make a record. I mean, being a nerd about these things, I read a lot of books and watch a lot of documentaries about how albums are made. And I don't think I've ever come across a story of anyone else making a record that way.
No.
So I'm sure, especially when you have someone like Andy Partridge, who's a bit of a, let's call him controlling, he's kind of a freak, some would say, to have him subjected to a process like that, I can only imagine. I mean, it's not surprising to me that the sparks flew between those two guys.
Yeah.
But we'll still say, he even very recently I've read, he says, Todd had problems with him, but he was a fantastic arranger. And the arrangements on that album, he still speaks very highly of. And I agree. I mean, I think it's, and to be fair, however hard the process was for the band, Todd did deliver. I mean, this album broke them in the States in a way that hadn't happened before, largely due to Dear God. But after that, they were set up and poised. The next album was, they got a lot of exposure in America with Oranges and Lemons after that because of what Skylarking had achieved. So it did work. The record company's plan did work, pairing them with Todd.
Yeah. Okay, so what was your next point of call? I should just say, the idea that I had for this video is that we could maybe just talk about our 3 favorite XTC records. Just before we do that, if we can just kind of backtrack. So where did you go next? Did you kind of dig straight back to the beginning, or did you kind of just randomly encounter them after that point?
So, I was thinking about this yesterday. It's funny, we forget sometimes that in those pre-internet days, where information made its way around much more slowly than it does now. There were no YouTube rabbit holes to go down. There were no Google search or Wikipedia rabbit holes to go down. If you wanted to learn about a band or somebody, you had to wait for the next magazine to arrive and hope maybe there'll be about them, or what's Rolling Stone have in it about anything. So I was kind of keeping my eye on the magazines. In the meantime, I think what I did do in the immediate aftermath of discovering and enjoying Skylarking is I did go back and purchase English Settlement, and I think the Big Express as well. Maybe that summer I picked up both of them. Didn't find them, I did like certain songs on each, but I didn't find either one of them as immediately wonderful as Skylarking. I did love many of the songs, but to me, neither of them were as consistent as I found Skylarking to be. But the next big thing was that same magazine, Stereo Review. I think it was the end of '87. a new issue came, and again, the record review section, best recording of the month, Sonic Sunspot by the Dukes of Stratosphere. Sure, and I'm like, those guys look a little like XTC. There it is. That's the CD version. Yes. Yeah. And I start reading the review, and it very quickly says, oh, this is XTC recording under a pseudonym. I'm like, oh, how cool is this? And, you know, it was the same guy that wrote the review, actually, who had written the Skylarking review, and he was raving about this one, too. He's like, you know, this one is even more like, you know, reminiscent, and it's a more direct pastiche or a tribute or whatever you want to call it, parody of those late 60s psychedelic records. I'm like, well, I have to get this one, too. And I bought that CD that you just showed, or got it for Christmas or something, and immediately fell in love with that. So that was my next big XTC thing. And then, of course, in '89, Oranges and Lemons followed. And in America, there were lots of articles in Rolling Stone and various other magazines. They were on MTV. Like they came and did that like little unplugged performance, and they would go around radio stations. Like they spent a lot of time in America. They recorded it in America actually as well, but they spent a lot of time in America promoting that record. So Oranges and Lemons was quite visible and heavily promoted. And of course, being already a fan, I was already, you know, on the inside track there. But I remember, you know, other people in my high school class, you know, coming to me, hey, you know this band XTC? I saw this video for the Mayor of Simpleton. I'm like, oh yeah, I love them. You should get that CD. It's awesome, you know. And so every album I just automatically picked up after that. I was a total 100% fan after that.
Yeah, I'd say I was quite similar to you. I mean, I don't actually remember what order I picked them up in. I suspect I might even have gone out and bought all of them in one fell swoop. You know, I can't actually remember, but I do seem to remember having a very similar experience to yourself, and that I didn't, you know, for a while, I didn't find anything that was immediately as great as Skylarking. And for a while, I almost became a little bit disenchanted with them, and I started to think, you know, maybe it was just a fluke. You know, they just worked with Todd Rundgren. He found something in them, molded it, and turned it. You know, a bit like what Bob Ezrin does. You know, with certain bands, he kind of identifies what's kind of unique about them, and he's able to just turn it into something extremely accessible. And for a long time, I mean, a couple of years ago now, or more like 3 or 4 years ago, I did a video here on YouTube, and it was one of my most watched videos ever that I've done, and it was about the songs of Colin Moulding.
Yeah, I remember that.
I gradually realized that the songs of Colin Moulding appealed to me more immediately. I could hear that they were not as adventurous or maybe not as interesting as the Andy Partridge songs, but they chimed more with me. I think as a Squeeze fan from back in the day and somebody who loved the Beatles and Paul McCartney, Colin's songs seemed to slip down quite nicely. But on certain records, you know, like on...
yes.
I mean, I do love some of the tracks on this. This World Over is one of my most favorite songs ever, I think, by anybody. It's just one of those songs that makes the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. You know, it's just
very much so
spine-chilling. But there's other stuff on this record by Andy Partridge where it almost sounds like he's being deliberately kind of trying to annoy his audience, or just trying to do something provocative and make people go, oh God, you know, almost like a kind of Neil Young heading into the ditch kind of thing, maybe, you know. And the Colin Moulding songs would be these little jewels of just melody and niceness. And then you go back to this Andy Partridge sort of confrontational, tangled, abrasive, annoying sometimes, you know.
Yeah, I have a very similar take on it. And that's why some of the albums, I think I alluded to before, you know, when I was talking about English Settlement and Big Express in particular.
Yeah.
You know, didn't love them all the way through. And I think it's for the exact same reason. Andy, you know, in the pre-Skylarking period, you know, Andy would always seem to throw in a few songs that were dissonant or angular or just jarring or maybe, as you say, annoying. And I had a very similar experience. You know, it was a slight bit of disappointment, like especially with the first time I played Big Express. It's like some of these songs I just don't like.
Yeah.
And, you know, similar, even as great of an album as I do think English Settlement is, it was a similar, there were certain songs on it where I was just like, I tended to gravitate kind of like you. I had the background of being a Beatles fan, Paul McCartney fan, and I love Squeeze too, and things like that. You know, I tended to, you know, I hate to put it in terms of, oh, I like the more conventional material, but I did prefer the more melodic. You know, they always had that ability underlying everything, even back to almost the very beginning. Like, I'm not a huge fan of the first 2 records, to be quite honest, because there's not a lot of that melodic, you know, thing peeping out yet. But there was a little bit of it always, and it kind of grew and grew and grew. And it was one of the things the Skylarking review I read actually mentioned. It's like, this album finally brings to light the full pop grandeur that we always suspected XTC was capable of, and now they're finally doing it. So I think there was a two-sided thing going on, and Andy had this side that wanted to be, maybe in the early days, very punk influenced or just abrasive.
Hmm.
And that seemed to decline a little bit with each album until the point where you got Skylarking era and beyond, where they left a lot of that behind. And I like it a lot better because of it, I think.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, I mean, it was quite interesting how Colin Moulding songs were often either chosen as singles, which used to annoy Andy, or they were chosen to lead off the album. So you have, there's a Colin Moulding song at the start of Drums and Wires, Making Plans for Nigel. You've got a Colin Moulding song at the start of English Settlement, at the start of Big Express, and what I thought perhaps later on was that Andy Partridge almost grudgingly maybe finally started to think, actually maybe I should try and do something not like Colin's doing exactly, but maybe is there something I can do? I think, as you say, perhaps after working with Todd, even though they'd had this really difficult working relationship, maybe he did subconsciously at least carry something away from that, and he started to write songs that were more commercial or less annoying. The more kind of like, let's actually try and entertain the audience now. I think that's what Todd kind of said to him early on in the process, wasn't it? He said, we can actually make something, Andy, that people will enjoy.
Yes, an album that people will go back to over and over again. And again, I think they succeeded. And I think the other part of this too was around that time, I remember reading this in some interviews or in some book, Dave Gregory was actively kind of getting Andy into things that he had never been into before, like the Beach Boys.
Right.
I've read this where around the Skylarking period, like, Andy said something like, well, Season Cycle was my first take on a Beach Boys type thing, because Dave had been playing me those records like Smiley Smile. I'm not talking about the Surfs and Fun in the Sun Beach Boys. I'm talking about the Smile or Smiley Smile era Beach Boys. And Dave Gregory was playing Andy at that stuff. And I think Andy really, it's clear he loved it, because after that he started writing songs that were very much influenced by that kind of thing. And I think, so there was a change on that. Rock Hills and Children on that album.
Hills and Children, the final song. I mean, it's really uncanny, isn't it? And isn't there a song on?
If you're thinking what I'm thinking of, a Duke song, yes, Hail and Precious is
Hail and Precious, the final song.
It's an overt Beach Boys tribute, or whatever you want to call it. And there's some very, very nice Beach Boy touches on that. And in fact, Dave Gregory told Andy, I know I read this, you're being stupid putting this on a Dukes record. This is such a great song. We should be doing this on a real XTC record. And they put it on there anyway. But
I mean, Andy being Andy, he would never be told, would he? He would never take any advice, and he would always do what he was totally stubborn. And it's quite interesting to imagine. I mean, the early XTC stuff, I mean, I'm kind of with you on this, and XTC fans tend to either gravitate towards the early stuff or the later stuff. I mean, I know here on YouTube, Larry Graves, Canadian Stud Muffin, he's a big fan of the early stuff. Loves the first maybe 3 or 4 albums, not so keen on the later stuff. But I think you and I are both in agreement. I quite enjoy the first 2 records, but it's only when Dave Gregory joins the band really that I really become a fan. And maybe that is because Dave Gregory was such a fantastic guitar player, so adaptable, just a chameleon. Just he could do anything, any little thing that you wanted him to do, he could do it. He could make it sound incredible.
Yeah, he was key to me to a lot of their best records. And he's one of those guys, like he one of these days, and I've had this idea for a few years, but one of these days I am going to make a video of my 5 favorite guitarists of all time, and he's a shoo-in for that list. One of the things I like about him, as you just kind of alluded to, is he could do anything. And he, some guitar, whatever you want to call them, guitar heroes, guitar gods, they're very attached to one particular kind of guitar. Like you always, Hendrix has his Stratocaster, Keith Richards has his Telecaster, Roger McGuinn has his Rickenbacker. Dave Gregory wasn't tied to any one guitar. He could pull out, he was like Mike Campbell in this way, of the Heartbreakers. He would pull out whatever color he needed. Like the painting, like, okay, well, this is a Les Paul sound we need here, or this is going to be a Rickenbacker, this is going to be a Tel. And he could play them all and just come up with a beautiful little solo or lick. And it was always very tasteful. It wasn't cliche. And, to me, the golden era is the Dave Gregory era, from Drums and Wires up to and including, he was on Apple Venus a little bit, I guess. But after he left the band, I thought, well, that's really a blow to the band. And before he joined the band, I'm less interested in those records. The
thing is about Dave Gregory is that he's not one of those musicians who, because you get musicians who are very adaptable, or chameleon-like, and they can. It's almost like these these guitarists who will say to you something like, what style do you want this in? Do you want it in flamenco style? Do you want it in this? Do you want it in that? He's not like that. He's not a kind of soulless virtuoso who can just do something to order. He was able to put a stamp on everything he did, and everything he did was just absolutely perfect for the song.
Yes. He always served the song.
Yeah.
And like I said, always came up, and my favorite kind of guitar solo is the short guitar solo that sounds kind of preconceived and written. Like, don't get me wrong, I do love to hear great players just improvise and do 2-minute solos and things like that. But I really love these tight little, well thought out, well written little solos. And Dave was one of the masters of that. You listen to a song like Pink Thing, or That's Really Super Super Girl. Those short little solos that are just perfect. The sound, the playing. Yeah. And I also love the story that, when they were recording Earn Enough for Us, Todd Rundgren said to him, "Come on, Dave, come up with one of those riffs that all the high school kids are going to want to learn." And he came up with that riff at the beginning of Earn Enough for Us. And he just always knew everything he played it just hit the spot and was right for the song.
But it was such an interesting dynamic in that band, because Dave wasn't a writer, was he? That was the kind of strange thing about it. You had Andy, Andy is being the main writer, who wrote almost too much in a way. He was this constant songwriting machine. You had poor old Colin, who he was much more slow as a writer. He would try and come up with some songs. They were always great, but there would only be maybe 2 or 3 of them per record, And then you had Dave, whose role was to just make everything sound fantastic, but he himself was not a writer.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know if that was a source of frustration for him, or if he was happy with that role that he had. I mean, he did have a very important role, despite not being a writer. Yeah. And he would also go to him for things like, the arrangement, the string arrangement for 1,000 Umbrellas. Dave wrote that arrangement.
Yeah.
Would depend on him for those things, and he contributed so much. As much as a person could without being a writer, he definitely contributed.
Yeah, he was sort of like the Mick Ronson, I guess, of the band, wasn't he?
Yes, that's a good.
Yeah, and then of course, I mean, you've got Colin Moulding, whose bass playing often comes in for attention, in the bass playing community, shall we say, online or magazines. He's one of those bass players who does crop up a lot. People do rate him. He's not just a guy that just plays along on the root note. He's doing all sorts of things, and his textures as well. All kinds of lovely, smooth kind of sounds, and fretless work that he does, and just again extremely adaptable, extremely versatile.
Yes, and he's similar to McCartney in the sense that you almost get the sense that he was a frustrated guitar player, because the bass lines he would come up with something like "The Mayor of Simpleton." You listen to that, it's like, whoa. That's quite a bass line. How did you even come up with that, and not let alone play it so fluidly? And it's a very busy bass line, similar to some of the latter day Beatle albums of McCartney's bass in that sense. And like you say, he wasn't just the kind of guy who would just plunk along on the root note. And he would write lines and little melodies on the bass, and that's another very distinctive flavor in their music.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that XTC, they came from this punk or new wave, whatever you want to call it, post-punk kind of background. Yeah. But their fan base, or the people who admire them, often you'll get people, say, who are very into just far-flung reaches of prog rock. You'll get people who are really big into like Van der Graaf Generator, or people who are just into these bands that you wouldn't think of them immediately as being classed along with bands like XTC, The Police, Squeeze, whatever these bands that came out of the new wave era. XTC seemed to have an ingredient, maybe call it a muso ingredient almost. Got the Dave Gregory, you've got the Colin Moulding. These guys could really play. Andy Partridge maybe less so. I don't know. I don't know enough about the guitar, but he seemed more like a songwriting guitarist who was going to bang his guitar into a strange tuning and do something confrontational.
I was surprised, because I used to think that too. Okay. But, being a guitar player myself, one of the rabbit holes I frequently go down on YouTube is looking at guitar videos. And I found one, I think it was, Guitar World, or one of these guitar magazines did. It was like a 2-part interview with Andy, where he had a Telecaster and he was demonstrating. I was like, what? Like, he's far better on the guitar than I ever gave him credit for. If you watch that video, There's a video, they did a rare live performance on television of Books Are Burning when Nonsuch came out. And Dave Gregory's playing an organ, I think. And it's just Andy on guitar, and he plays a solo at the end that blew me away. Mm-hmm. And I didn't even realize it was probably him on the record too. But when I saw him do that live on television, I was like, Andy, I think he's quite underrated actually as a guitar player himself. Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good.
Well, certainly his musicianship is not in doubt. I mean, a song that always blows my mind is from the album Nonsuch, and it's the song Rook, which is just him and a piano, really.
Yeah. And
he wrote it after a long period of writer's block where he'd become concerned or even, genuinely scared, I think, that he'd run out of songs and there was nothing more, and he was in his shed going mad. And he just got on the piano and started, playing these chords. And this song came out, this song Rook. And it's still, even thinking about it makes the hair on the back of my neck stand on end, just these really amazingly voiced piano chords. And often, the judge of him, how great a musician is, to me on the keyboard is what chord voicings are you going to come up with? Exactly what inversions are you going to use? What note are you going to put on the bottom? What note are you going to put on the top? How far apart are your notes going to be?
Yes.
And can you produce a sound on the piano which is just absolutely uniquely you? There's no link to anything else. It doesn't sound like a bit of Ray Charles or a bit of this or a bit of that. It's just Andy Partridge piano chords, just haunting. And then he just does this haunting melody over the top, this kind of slow building. And it's just a song of winter, isn't it? It's just a kind of desolate scene, quite kind of painterly, I guess.
Very atmospheric, and he's so good at that. And there's in the XTC documentary they made a couple years ago, he talks about his method for coming up with chord sequences, and it's very unorthodox. Even on the guitar, he'll just find. He's like, the first thing I often do is just try to find a chord I've never played before.
Yeah,
and I don't know what it is, but that reminds me of a puddle. Or that way, thinks very like, oh, that sounds like, a blue sky and a meadow, like, and that'll lead him into a lyrical direction as well. But it also. He's very unorthodox with chord sequences, and that's one of the great things about his writing. I think you nailed that observation because, he does have a sound and a feeling that's all his own musically.
Right. Well, we've chewed the fat over the musicians in the band, so shall we now get on and we don't need to spend too long about it. If we just do a quick rundown of the 3 records, which we would say, right, the house is burning down. We can choose 3 XTC albums.
Yeah.
Which are the 3? So do you want to just do yours straight away, and then I'll do mine, and then we'll see.
So I'll just do mine in chronological order rather than anything else. So I don't think my choices are going to surprise too many people, but based on what we've already talked about.
Okay.
But the number 1 for me is just going to be Skylarking because, see, my criteria for this choice of 3 is. And it was very easy for me to decide this for the most part, but it was just which albums do I just love all the way through?
Yeah.
And which ones do I play the most? And I don't have to skip any tracks. And this is, obviously the case with Skylarking because, there's not a song on here I don't like. And like I said before, it never gets old to me. It has a unique feel to it. It's the one record they made with Todd Rundgren, and, even other albums Todd Rundgren has produced and Todd's own work, I don't really know of any other album that sounds quite like this. And, every song, and it's very Colin heavy, by the way. This is one of the XTC, there's the most Colin songs. And, I love every one of them.
Well, there's 2 songs at the end that are by Colin. Dying and Sacrificial Bonfire are both Colin songs, aren't they?
That's right. And, Big Day, and he's got Grass.
Yeah. So,
it's just a wonderful mix of Andy and Colin. It's well produced. Dave Gregory's arrangements and playing on it are all wonderful. I really love it, and I love it all the way through. So that's my number 1 pick. Okay. And I am going chronologically, but even if I were ranking them, that would still probably be number 1. The next one I am going to pick is the Duke's record, Sonic Sunspot. This is a British colored vinyl, it's a splatter type, but it looks very grayish purple to me. But in any case. It's another album I never have to skip a track, and I never get tired of it. And I think coming right off the back of Skylarking like it did. I think they recorded it very quickly after, within a year of Skylarking. I think they were on a roll, writing wise and just playing wise, and you know, you can tell they were having fun. And a lot of people will say, well, you know, the EP, the 25 o'clock EP they did earlier as the Dukes is better. I prefer this one. I mean, they're both great, but that's my second pick. And my third one, I don't know if this may surprise you or it may not, is Apple Venus Volume 1.
Oh, okay, interesting.
Similar reason, you know, I just love every song, and there's nothing on here I would have to skip. And it's a bit Colin light. There's only 2 Colin songs, but Andy's songs are so strong for me on this record that it's not really an issue. And yeah, I mean, the loss of Dave, I know Dave was involved in the early stages of this, and you know, when they were demoing things, and I think he does play on a few tracks, but he had left the band by the time this came out. But I don't know. I'm pretty sure I've read Andy believes this is their strongest album.
It's interesting.
I don't know if I would say it's their strongest. It's very different than some of the earlier stuff. It's more mellow, and there's not, you know, heavy electric guitar and drums on this record. But to me, that song-wise, it's very, very strong. And again, I just never get tired of it, and I don't have to skip anything. So that's why that's my third pick.
That's actually broken my memory. You know, I said earlier on that I couldn't remember what the next record was that I heard after Skylarking. Mm-hmm. It was actually Apple Venus.
Yeah.
And I think at the time, I don't know, I expected another Skylarking, and it wasn't.
Yeah.
And I was disappointed. I did enjoy it, but it was a bit of a kind of like, oh, right, this is not quite the same. And I think perhaps for that reason, it's never quite elevated itself for me right up there. But I suspect with both those last 2 records, I haven't spent enough time with them over the years, and it might be time to actually, maybe I should get the vinyl versions. You know, often that's a way of, you know, trying to bond with a record more, you know, get a really nice vinyl pressing of it and actually get into it like that, you know.
Yeah, the reissue that came out a few years ago is outstanding. It sounds really, really good.
I didn't pick it up, but I should. Yeah, so
I think with me, I'll just talk about this for a quick minute.
Yeah.
My perspective coming into Apple Venus was I was already an XTC fanatic in the early 90s. And then after Nonsuch, they famously didn't record another album for something like 7 years because they were in dispute with Virgin Records, and they were sort of on strike. So as an XTC fan, that was a long time to wait, and the anticipation for me for Apple was so palpable and strong. You know, when it came out, I was like, oh, and to me, I loved it. Again, I loved it first listen, and because, you know, I had been trading bootleg CDRs with other XTC fans, and the demos had leaked.
Yeah.
And I already knew some of the songs because I'd heard some of the demos that they had been making throughout the 90s. They kept recording at home, just their demos, writing these songs. And so for me, I had a very different perspective, I think, because the anticipation was so high, and I was waiting. And finally, there's a new XTC album. And yeah, I thought it was great.
Cool stuff. Right. Okay. Well, I'll do something similar now. And I did agonize a little bit over this. One of the things that was slightly worrying me, I was trying to be too representative, I think, in my mind. Initially I wanted to ideally represent the early phase of the band. So I was immediately drawn towards listening again to, you know, Drums and Wires and the Black Sea. And when I listened to Black Sea, I did think to myself, it'd be a shame not to feature this one, because it is such an interesting record. It's got such great songs on it, but it's got that abrasive thing going on, you know. So if anybody who's watching this video who's never heard XTC, don't let our kind of later period prevent you from checking out the early period, because particularly after Dave joins, Drums and Wires, Black Sea, English Settlement, all great, you know, but I decided in the end not to go down that route. So the first one I'm going to show is one that has really grown on me over the years, and when I first heard it, I don't think the band were particularly happy with it, and it wasn't a big success or anything, and it's this record, Mama.
Yeah. Now,
this one to me almost sounds like, in a way, a kind of first attempt at doing something a bit Skylarking-y. Obviously, it's pre Todd Rundgren. Drummer is still in the band briefly. I think Terry Chambers. I think he left halfway through, didn't he? 'Cause he didn't like the way things had started to get a bit more folky.
Yeah, he did leave partway through the recording of that. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is the record that they made after English Settlement, after they've given up touring, and Andy's decided he can't face the road anymore, and they're going to go down a different route. And it's a very, I don't know, kind of pastel shaded autumnal kind of record. It's got a very nice kind of English folky flavor to it. You just really, it's got a kind of Kinks thing going on in a sense. You imagine, the village green, and you can hear sort of, horse clip cloppings going on, and you just imagine the May Queen and the Morris dancers. There's just something very kind of oldie English about it, which I just find very comforting.
Yeah.
And I think the subtlety of their playing, this is the album that first properly comes across, because after Terry Chambers leaves the band, because Terry Chambers is one of the great kind of crashy, bangy drummers, isn't he? He's loud, he's aggressive. And sometimes it can sort of, I think on English Settlement in particular, it gets a bit much. It gets a bit like, oh, it'd be nice to just calm down a bit,
Right.
And this is the record where they do, XTC, they kind of calm down and they reveal this other side to them.
Right.
He's very lyrical, very soft, and I just love the songs on it. I mean, you've got Beating of Hearts. I love Love on a Farm, Boys' Wages. It's such an individual, folky, interesting little song,
Beautiful song.
Lady Bird, In Loving Memory of a Name, just some beautiful tracks. And I don't think the band themselves are that happy with it, but it's one that has definitely grown on me over time. And it's a nice prelude, I think, to Skylarking.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's interesting that they kind of diverted a little bit off that road into Big Express right after that, and then they kind of did Skylarking, because Mummer to me would have made a more logical lead into something like Skylarking.
Exactly. Yeah.
There's another song on there called Wonderland of Colin.
Colin, yeah.
Very different than anything they would have done before, because I think it's either a drum machine or electronic drums, I think, to make up for Terry's absence, perhaps. But what a nice, pleasant little pop song. I believe it was a single in the UK.
He sings it in a very high voice, doesn't he? He's pitches it right up.
Yeah, it's a nice record. I should listen to that one more than I do, actually. You just kind of put it back in my brain.
Yeah, so if we go chronologically, then I can be quite predictable now. Skylarking is my favorite XTC record. In fact, I was playing it last night and I was thinking, actually, is this my favorite album of all time? Because I still have that thing where I go through the track and I'm like, love this song, love this song, love this song, love this song. It just keeps coming all the way through, and there's very few records that I can actually do that with.
Yes.
And it has a flow to it, and that's the thing, isn't it?
Yeah, that's one of the nice things about it. And I feel very similarly. To me, I usually say it's my third favorite album of all time. The only ones I'd put above it are Revolver and Pet Sounds. So that's pretty
fair enough. Yeah.
It never gets old for me. I love that record.
Yeah. Okay, so my third choice, again, this is one that has grown on me. Now, I nearly went with Oranges and Lemons, but that one, I think, maybe has got a bit of a kind of 80s, there's a kind of 80s sheen to it, which I do sometimes struggle with a little bit. Yeah. There's a bit of Tears for Fears coming through here and there on it, I think.
Yes.
I do but I think it's the sound of it is a bit homogenized if you compare it to what went before and perhaps what came after. So even though I love the songs on that record, I was a bit dubious about that one. But this one is another one which has grown on me a lot. Yeah. And I know this came out as a vinyl reissue recently too, which I completely failed to pick up. But this is Nonsuch, which came out, I think, was it 91?
I believe so, yes. 92, 91, one of those years.
Yeah, it's a really long album. Now, was it produced by Gus Dudgeon, the guy that did Elton John?
Yep.
I don't think they had a particularly great working relationship with him either, but it's a very, very solid record. It starts out with the ballad of Piece of Pumpkinhead, which is one of those songs where you think Andy has now learned to write pop songs now. He's moving away from the kind of annoying songs, learning to be lyrical, and he's learning to be poppy and perhaps a bit more straightforward.
Definitely. That was very nearly in my list. It's such a strong record, and some of the very, very best XTC songs are on that record.
Yeah, I mean, you've got My Bird Performs, which is just a wonderful song. The Colin Moulding song, which has this wonderful trumpet solo in it and really great guitar playing. And it's very sweet sounding, very melancholy, quite a moving song too. The words of the song are quite moving.
Yes, they are.
Polly Upon Poppy, beautiful song. Rook is on here. Colin's song Bungalow, which always makes me smile because when I was a kid, we actually lived in a bungalow, and So that song, that song is quite special to me. The Ugly
Beautiful.
Underneath, I don't know, it's really grown on me over time. And again, it's one of those records where you just think it's a long album, but you just keep thinking, yeah, like this song, like this song, like this song.
Yeah.
It just,
If this had been top four, it would have been in my list. It was very hard to leave it off. Like I say, a few of my all-time favorite XTC songs are on there. Humble Daisy, to me,
yeah, beautiful.
that's a string of those Beach Boy type songs Andy wrote, and with the falsetto vocals, it has a very, to me, Beach Boy feel to it. And as a huge Beach Boy fan, I love that. And yeah, like you say, My Bird Performs. I really like Then She Appeared. It's got that really cool 12 bar. And yeah, I mean, we can go through every song. There's just so much strong material on that record.
Yeah. I think it's one of Dave's best. I think it's one of Dave's best records. There's so many acoustic parts, and like you say, 12-string playing and folky stuff he does on there. It's really textured and interesting.
And as his big last hurrah as a member of the band, it's the last full album he took part in.
Yeah,
couldn't have gone out in a better way. It's just such a masterful sounding record. It was well recorded, well played.
Yeah.
Very well written. Yeah, it was hard to leave it off my list. I'm glad you put it yours.
I listened to them back to back, and I thought, even though Black Sea has got that very punky, aggressive energy, which I think you have to hear if you don't know XTC's music, you've got to listen to Drums and Wires and the Black Sea to get that, and there'll be some XTC fans watching this. You'll be going, no, it's the first two albums that you must listen to, but of course, but it's just a matter of taste, and I think we're both agreed that it's when Dave joins the band that they gain a certain musical heft, I think, and a certain, I suppose, just an ability to transcend their origins. I suppose, all those bands that came out of that movement, the punk movement, the post-punk movement, very, very few bands were able to evolve and turn into what XTC turned into. I mean, they just didn't have it in them, essentially, just that level of musicality. And it's quite ironic because, punk was sort of meant to be about, anti-music, not being a musician, having three chords, just making a racket, just making a row. And XTC did that. They did make a horrible racket. Yeah. Just like a lot of those bands did. But then they just the genius stroke of just evolving from that into this very beautiful, complex, quite musically advanced thing, really, where you get, musicologists who love classical music will listen to XTC and go, wow, really, pop music can do that then, chord sequences like that, we can do that in pop music. Well, and that does link them back, I guess, to the Beatles and to the whole kind of art rock tradition.
It was when XTC stopped touring, just like with the Beatles, when they stopped touring and they went and made Sgt. Pepper, and they got a little more far out and adventurous with their records. And I think the same thing happened with XTC. Oh, you know what? We don't have to worry about doing this stuff live anymore. Let's bring in orchestras. Let's have all these keyboard parts. I think earlier on they were limiting themselves. Well, we're going to have to play this on stage. But yeah, their evolution was quite amazing. And I remember, it was just a very quick point too. I remember seeing an interview with Andy at one point. I think it was around the time Apple Venus came out. They put out a box set around the same time called Transistor Blast, which was their BB sessions. It was like 4 CDs. And he said, well, I had to listen to this thing. I put it on in the kitchen and I laughed my socks off. He said, I forgave that skinny kid who just wanted to get on stage and make a horrible noise and drink the world dry. And it was fun to rediscover. You got a sense of how far even Andy felt he had come from those days, listening to that stuff again. And they really did cover a lot of bases. And another thing that's great about XTC is every album is quite different. They didn't really repeat themselves in too many ways. And again, very much like the Beatles, there was a sense of growth and evolution throughout their career. So.
And I guess a similar sad postscript in a way, in the sense that they did end up falling out with each other, essentially. I mean, Dave left, he couldn't handle Andy anymore, and then Colin and Andy never really, don't think, had a big explosion of a big fallout. But I mean, the last thing I heard was that, I don't think Andy and Colin even see each other anymore. They don't seem to socialize. And of course, Colin and Terry Chambers are now back touring again and making music together. And it'd be so great if Andy would just stop being Andy and just agree to join them and do something. But it seems like it's not even in a faint realm of possibility. There just seems to have been a schism for some reason.
The schism might not be as great as the one that divides the Smiths But I always think of these two bands, XTC and the Smiths, as the two bands, particularly from that era, that all the members are still alive. I would love to see them get back together. And
Yeah.
I'm quite, it'll never happen with either of them. Yeah, Andy and Colin, I'm not sure what caused them to fall out. I think it was I know I read things where they had disagreements about the reissues that have all been coming out. And Andy said, yeah, so he moved and didn't tell me he while and that's it. So yeah, something happened. Maybe we're not privy to all the details. It's probably happened, but
It's a shame that if you read this book where they're all three of them sat there talking to each other about the songs, and they seem to be getting on quite well, don't they? There's quite a lot of humorous banter, I guess you'd describe it, but you can kind of see there's a few tensions maybe in the undertow there coming through, just little quips here and there about Andy's stubbornness or about this, that, or the other. And I guess it happens. Bands don't stay together forever, but like you say, it would be so great to think of another XTC album at some point further down the line. But I guess we can just keep on dreaming about that one.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be happy with an Andy Partridge solo album, but even that seems to be beyond what he wants to do, which is a shame. Such a good run.
Yeah. I mean, he just lives in a little tiny house now in Swindon, I think, and Dave Gregory, one of the greatest guitarists of his generation, not doing that much, I don't think. I think Colin and Terry now are the only two who are actually doing anything. So at least
kind of a waste. Yeah.
Good stuff. Well, thank you, Jeff. That was an extremely interesting discussion from my part. I hope you enjoyed it.
Very much so. Yes. Thank you for inviting me.
Anytime. So let us know, folks, what do you think? I know XTC, they're not exactly a kind of, unregarded band. There are so many videos out there about XTC and, lots of things have been said about them. So I know we're not covering any new ground here, but hopefully you found what we had to say vaguely interesting or entertaining, whatever. So leave us some comments. What's your favorite XTC album? 3 XTC albums. Let us know what you think. And we'll see you soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.